I would like to introduce you today to Larry Pearl. Larry worked at the Housing and Home Finance Agency and Department of Housing and Urban Development from 1961 to 1998, starting in the Office of General Counsel as attorney advisor and then moving to the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, where he spent the balance of his career, heading up a number of HUD's offices in that area. His HUD career culminated as the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Program Operations and Compliance. He's a charter member of the Senior Executive Service. While at HUD, he developed and implemented settlements of complex civil rights litigation involving alleged discrimination by HUD and public housing agencies. He also developed a comprehensive program to implement the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988, including overseeing drafting of regulations, estimating complaint load, and developing and securing support for budget within HUD and OMB, standing for Office of Management Budget. He received an SES, the Senior Executive Service Meritorious Rank Award, based largely on this effort. As a strong advocate for fair housing and equal opportunity, he published guidebooks and trained over 2,000 HUD staff, state and local government staff, and civil rights groups. Post-retirement from HUD, as a civil rights consultant, he developed an online course on the history of housing discrimination from the Civil War to 1968 for the National Fair Housing Training Academy. So welcome, Larry Pearl.
Hi, Nan. I'd like to just start maybe with a few thoughts about how I got into civil rights. I was born and raised in a white section of Philadelphia and attended schools initially that were all white until I got to a citywide high school, Central High School in Philadelphia, which was much more integrated, a public school. And I was trying to decide what college to go to and settled on Antioch. And the reason was there was a classmate who somehow knew about Antioch. I think he may have attended it at some point. And the things that attracted me to Antioch were two. One was that it had a work-study program, as many colleges do now. And secondly, it was the location. I had never been west of Pittsburgh, and Antioch is near Dayton, Ohio, in Yellow Springs. So off I went to Antioch, and I had 3 jobs in Washington, D.C., 2 of them with the federal government, and became a government major at Antioch. And my first job off campus was with the Cleveland Urban Renewal Agency. I didn't have any connection particularly to government or otherwise at that point. And the Cleveland agency was an interesting one. This would have been 1952, before the Urban Renewal Program. And the one thing about that, though, was not so much the work at the agency. It was very cold. It was November and December. I still remember 2 of the coldest months I've ever spent with the wind off Lake Erie. But what was the key was finding housing. All Antioch students had to find housing when they went out on jobs. And I was with 2 other students, Vic, white like me, and Cleveland, who was African, not African American. He was from Ghana, now Gold Coast. So the 3 of us looked up articles in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, made phone calls. Is it still available? Yes. We'd show up, and gosh, what a coincidence. Places, they kept getting rented before we got there, no matter how quickly we got out after calling. So we figured out, being good college students, what was going on. And Vic and Cleveland repaired to the Y for a week. And I fortunately was rooming my college roommate was from Cleveland. So I was able to stay with his parents. And for a week we kept at it and finally found somebody who was willing to rent to us. And that, as you would expect, made an impression. And I also, when I was in DC for a summer job, I saw the segregation, particularly at Maryland, and also still in the district. We went to beaches in the Delaware beaches, interestingly, were then integrated. At least blacks and whites could both be on the beaches. But when we came back toward Washington, in Maryland, our one black student, Russ Gaines, we could go through the front door at an eatery in Maryland, but Russ couldn't do that. And I was in the Supreme Court when they handed down the Thompson cafeteria case. That was in 1953, which held that DC's ancient public accommodations law was still in effect. And when we went to the local cafeteria that night, the owner downplayed the idea that blacks would soon eat there, but they did within days. So I went on from there to the Harvard Graduate School, Social Relations. That was interesting because I lived at 29 Lawrence Street, which was half a block from the corner of Lawrence and Pearl. I never figured out how that happened. On to Yale Law School, still a government major, where I had a summer job with the Community Development Agency in Easton, Pennsylvania. And after I graduated, I worked, and took 6 months in the National Guard, including basic training at Fort Knox, which was an integrated experience, as you can imagine. And I then worked for a law firm for a year in DC and helped to work on a book about the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, which was an interesting little stint. And then it was time to really get more serious. So I went to the Housing and Home Finance Agency and made the rookie mistake of going to personnel. If you are looking for a legal job, that is not the place to start. You start with the Office of General Counsel. So I learned that, fortunately, and was hired as a GS-9 attorney advisor. I worked for a guy named Edward Levette, Eddie Levette. At that time, I think he was the only black lawyer in OGC. Eddie had graduated from Howard Law School in 1932, received a master's degree from Harvard in 1936. He was African American. And he was working with the law firm of Charles Houston, who was a close associate of Thurgood Marshall. In fact, he got his master's at Harvard while he was working with that law firm. And I've always regretted that I didn't get more stories from Eddie about his work. He started working in housing after he left the Houston law firm. And he worked for the federal government from about 1938, I think, until he retired some years later. He was a wonderful supervisor. He was a wonderful draftsman. And I was so fortunate to work with him. That was a wonderful coincidence. And I got interested in fair housing partly because of Eddie, I think, but also I was living then in a part of Washington, which really had initially had been all white. By the time my wife and I moved in, this would have been 1959 probably, or 60. The area was just beginning to get integrated. The Supreme Court had thrown out the business of restrictive covenants at that point. And so blacks were able to get north of Arkansas Avenue. And in fact, on our block, there was a Superior Court judge who was African American. But the neighborhood, my immediate neighborhood, was still largely white. And I got involved with something called Neighbors Incorporated, which was a nonprofit group that had been set up to try to initially encourage both blacks and whites to come to the neighborhood. And as real estate people started blockbusting and trying to get more blacks in, the effort became more to get whites to still be interested in the community so it would remain integrated. And that was an interesting thing that went on parallel to what I was doing at HUD. And right at that point, I was so fortunate. It's still in the general counsel's office. What happened was the HUD came into being. That would have been 1965. And at that point, the first general counsel of HUD came in. That was a gentleman named Tom McGrath Jr. He had been a congressman, Democratic congressman from South Jersey. and he was elected in the landslide of President Johnson in 1964, and he was voted out in 1966, and then came to HUD as the first general counsel. And I became his special assistant, which was a fascinating job because at that point, we were trying to merge the lawyers who worked for public housing and FHA. They had their own legal staffs, and we were trying to get one general counsel's office. And that was a challenge, and it was an interesting time to be there. But on top of that, somehow I became the HUD liaison to the National Commission on Urban Problems. That was called the Douglas Commission. It was run by former Senator Paul Douglas from Illinois. And the Douglas Commission was charged with looking at cities around the country and making recommendations about how to deal with what was then the civil rights movement was surging upward at this point. This would have been 1966, 67, 68, during that period. And they decided that they would hold hearings around the country. They went to more than a dozen cities. And I, as the HUD liaison, went with them to all of those cities and just got a real education about what was going on in the country. On top of that, I would write up reports for Secretary Weaver. And I remember at least one occasion when I briefed him personally. Most of them were just sent forward in writing. And I was regarded by the commission as the HUD spy rather than the HUD liaison, because I was able to sit in on their private meetings as well as their public hearings and report on those as well. It was a very interesting assignment, and I learned an awful lot during that period. And then we come to April 1968, and the Fair Housing Law is passed 1 week after the King assassination. I had no particular connection with the law. I was delighted that there was a law. And in fact, I had written a co-authored a law review article earlier in OGC, something called, it was the half the states, half the population at that point were covered by fair housing laws. The state laws started with Colorado in 1959, but they really, more and more were passed. And by the time of the mid-60s, there were many states that had these kinds of laws. So the law is passed, and there was a signature at the White House with President Johnson. And I was, many of the HUD people went over for the ceremony, and afterward, President Johnson, there was a receiving line, and we went down the line shaking hands. And I thought to myself, it's important if you're shaking hands with the president to use a strong handshake. And I will swear to this day that when I gave him a strong handshake, he grimaced because, of course, he had shaken so many hands. So that wasn't my best moment, but something you remember, certainly. And I also remember, of course, President Nixon being elected, partly because George Romney was the HUD secretary. That was important. What also important was his first assistant secretary for equal opportunity, later called Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. That was a gentleman named Samuel J. Simmons. Sam Simmons was a friend. He's African American, and I knew him. He worked at the Civil Rights Commission, and our wives knew each other. It was almost a social thing. And here he was being confirmed as the assistant secretary for fair housing, for equal opportunity. And the other thing was that meant that position, only the second government agency to have a position at that level on civil rights, the other being the Department of Justice. So that was important. And it was the kind of thing that I was so fortunate because Sam knew I had been in housing for those, it would have been about 8 years at that point. And he said, Larry, why don't you come up and be my special assistant for a while? I'll just detail you up here and you can help me learn the ropes. And I said I would be delighted to do that. And after a couple of months, he said, "Why don't you stay here with a promotion and be my special assistant?" And I said, I could live with that too. I gratefully accepted that offer. And Sam had early on in his administration, he had the lead equal opportunity persons in the 6 regional HUD offices. There were 6 then, 10 later. The 6 directors come to Washington for a meeting. And one director was from Texas. His name was A. Maceo Smith, African American. He had been a regional race relations advisor for the United States Housing Authority in the late 30s and the early 40s. And he described what civil rights enforcement was like in those days before there were any laws anywhere. So Maceo said one day he got a call from Washington. There was a problem at the New Orleans Housing Authority that he needed to deal with. The authority was segregated, like almost all public housing, but even at the Black projects, few Black managers were appointed, and the ones that were limited in their compensation to less than several white managers. So Maceo went to New Orleans, probably on a segregated train or bus, and he went to the high-rise building where the authority was located, rode the elevator to the proper floor, presented his card to the white secretary. She looked at the card, she looked at him, she looked at the card. Obviously, she had never seen a Black man with a card before. And while she was looking back and forth, her boss came in and told Maceo that he could leave. The authority was not interested in talking about the issues. So Maceo replied he understood that Mr. X was very busy, but if he could just set aside a small temporary office so that they could discuss issues when he was less busy. And Mr. X's reply was, "No way." So Maceo repaired to a hotel. He called Washington. Robert Weaver, who was then the head of the U.S. Housing Authority, Mr. Weaver placed a call to the mayor of New Orleans. "Mayor," he said, "we don't have an unlimited amount of money for public housing. And if we don't get this matter resolved, New Orleans might no longer be on our list." So Maceo got a call at the hotel asking him to return to the Housing Authority. And when he arrived, he was taken to the top floor of the building, where he walked into a large open space with drafting tables, probably used by the architects and engineers, who were likely all white, and it was entirely empty. And as he was considering where to sit, the elevator door opened to reveal a young white woman, who today might be referred to as a chickie. "Mr. Smith," she drawled, "the director said I was to assist you in any way possible." Maceo said all he could think of at that point was that if a Black man fell out of a window and was about to land on a white woman, his best move was to fall right back up. "Thank you kindly," he said, "but I won't be needing your help." One of the federal buildings in Dallas, as well as a technical high school, is named for Mr. Smith today. I was always fascinated as to how our field directors, especially Maceo in Texas and Al Thompson in Atlanta, could make the transition from solving problems with their wits like that to solving problems with law enforcement. And establishing the new office was very challenging. Secretary Romney was extremely supportive. He mandated that all issuances of program offices, FHA, public housing, community development, had to go through the Fair Housing Office for comment. And we would then try to attach civil rights related program requirements. That meant that if a recipient of HUD program dollars violated such a requirement, it would face not only a civil rights investigation, but also a possible loss of program funds. Working with other federal agencies as directed by the Act was challenging also. We tried to develop a logo to represent equal housing opportunity. Our idea was a small house with an equal sign inside, and you can still see those symbols today. But the lending agencies wanted to put a dollar sign inside, and they finally agreed to our model, but their logo said equal housing lender rather than equal housing opportunity. We had a sticking point on racial data. We had to go all the way to President Nixon to get an okay for that, although in the same issuance, he indicated that subsidized housing in the suburbs was a non-starter, an issue that eventually cost Mr. Romney, Secretary Romney, his job. And at that point, I had another problem. I got a call from the Housing and Development reporter. Here I am, just a special assistant in Sam Simmons' office. I had absolutely no contact with the press. And here this reporter was calling me and asking me, how were things going on civil rights? And I didn't say this was off the record or anything like that. And we just had a very nice chat. And about a week later, I got a package at HUD, and I never got, why would I get mail at HUD? And it was from the Housing and Development reporter. And I thought, oh, this must be in connection with my chat with the reporter. So I opened the package, and in that issue of the Housing Development Reporter was an interview with Larry Pearl, a special assistant to Sam Simmons, the first director of equal opportunity at HUD. And Mr. Pearl said, Secretary Romney talks a good game on civil rights, but we'll see if he can produce. And telling this and repeating this story today, I still feel my stomach drop as it did, what would this have been now, 50 years ago? So I had two choices at that point. I could jump out the window, except I couldn't because the windows at HUD were locked. And the only other choice was to immediately take that into Sam and say, you have to see this. And he looked at the story and kind of grimaced a little bit and said, well, you know, I think we can deal with this. And I never heard another word. If some other secretaries had been in office, are you there, Mr. Cuomo? I would have been out of the office that day, no question about it. I never heard another word. So Sam left at some point, and I was promoted to the senior executive service and headed up a new office called Program Standards and Data Analysis. At that point, one of my division directors was named Barry Anderson, and the guy we worked in the General Counsel's office was Harry Carey. So we had the Harry, Barry, and Larry show, and that was we were a very good team, actually. A section of the Fair Housing Act, 8085, said that the Secretary of HUD was to administer the department's housing and urban development programs in a manner to affirmatively further fair housing, whatever that meant. And we tried to carry out that responsibility, but personnel in other parts of HUD were not always on board. The director at FHA, also a federal appointee, president confirmed, Gene Gullidge, a North Carolina home builder. The public housing director was Larry Cox. He was the head of a Southside Virginia public housing agency. And the histories of FHA and public housing were not exactly sympathetic to civil rights in those days. Public housing was segregated from the start, and FHA at one point would not insure mortgages of blacks, even to the point where if a black moved into a block, the entire block, whites on the block, they couldn't get any mortgage coverage either. And we had individual problems too. There was a situation in Georgia at one point where we were deciding to hold a Title VI hearing. Title VI required non-discrimination, and apparently this Georgia authority, they just hadn't come along. And the Title VI hearings required the approval of the secretary. And after the hearing, I got a call from somebody in civil rights in Georgia who told me that the public housing director in Georgia had testified in favor of the housing authority. And I couldn't believe that. And he said, well, they told me that it was okay because he took annual leave that day. And I said, oh, right, that made it okay. In Texas, we had a community development person. We required communities to develop analyses of impediments to fair housing. And they were supposed to be a real hard look at what the community was doing. And this gentleman was telling people in his area, oh, just put something down on paper and toss it in the file. So the connection between us and the program people was not always very direct. And it was highlighted by an incident with the General Counsel. General Counsel was a man named Sherman Unger. He had been the director for President Nixon in Ohio. And we had this issue. We were getting out handbooks now on the fair housing law and things like that. And we had some small issues, as I recall, with the General Counsel's office. And so we thought that we could just get around the table and solve those couple of issues. And so we met in a conference room. Mr. Unger was across the table with a number of his lawyers, whom we worked with, including Harry Carey. And on our side was Sam Simmons, who was not an attorney. I was there as one special assistant, as an attorney. His other special assistant, also an attorney. His housing director, housing discrimination man, he was also an attorney. So Sam is surrounded by attorneys. And he says, Sherm, we've got just these small issues. And I think, a few minutes of discussion here, we should be able to straighten them out. Unger said, no, Sam, that's not why we're here. We're here because you're trying to interfere with the running of the General Counsel's office. And Sam was just flabbergasted. He said, well, sure, it's true. I've got these attorneys here, but we always defer to you on matters of legal matters. Unger stood up. He said, are you calling me a liar? You're calling me a liar. And he walked out of the room, followed, of course, by his other lawyers. And we were sitting there with an empty table across from us. And I've never forgotten that. And Undersecretary Dick Van Dusen took, I think it was 6 months before Sam Simmons and Mr. Unger would even talk to each other after that. So that was the kind of thing we were working with. And fast forward to the 1980s, and here we have the laws being strengthened, the federal fair housing law. They added disability and familial status as matters to be covered, created an enforcement mechanism, expanded the definition of discriminatory housing practice, all sorts of changes. And it required HUD to issue regulations to implement and interpret the act and report to Congress annually. And I was detailed to the Assistant Secretary's office to develop a comprehensive program to implement the Amendments Act, including overseeing drafting and estimating complaint load, getting support for a budget. And I received an SES Meritorious Rank Award for this effort, which was really, it was just really the height of my federal career, working with all those different entities and trying to get the kinds of things that I thought that we would need. And I should mention, we had two other programs administered by Fair Housing. One was called the Fair Housing Assistance Program, which of course was called FAT. That was enacted in 1980, and it provided funding annually to state and local agencies that enforced fair housing laws that were equivalent to the federal law. And then there was the Fair Housing Initiatives Program. That, of course, was called FIP. And that was enacted in 1987, funding to fair housing organizations, other nonprofits who assist people who think they've been victims of housing discrimination. Often they would use testers to see whether there was discrimination as claimed by complainants. So at that point, we had a general counsel named John Knapp. And we also, in public affairs, we had a guy named Bob Knipp. So what we had was Knapp and Knipp talking about FAT and FIP. Like that can't be right, but it was actually. So I retired in HUD in 1998 after serving almost 2 years as the acting deputy assistant secretary for program operations and compliance in the Fair Housing Office. And 1998 was also the year HUD tried to develop an affirmatively furthering fair housing regulation. That's only 20 or 10 years after the earlier legislation. But local opposition killed it. And it wasn't until 2015 that HUD issued a final rule which the current administration is proposing to undo. So the future of fair housing is cloudy. Obviously, much depends on the policies of future HUD administrators and the president that they report to, and the courts, which I really should not overlook. I haven't mentioned the courts except briefly before. Overall, courts have been supportive of efforts to eradicate housing discrimination. In 1982, in the Havens Realty case, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the right of testers to examine whether housing providers were engaging in discrimination. That was so even if the testers were disguising their true identities and other details, like their incomes, in order to see how providers would act in similar situations. Again, in 2015, the Supreme Court, in Texas Department of Housing Community Affairs versus Inclusive Communities Project, held that a violation could be based on policies that had a disparate impact in providing housing to protected classes, in addition to prosecuting policies intended to discriminate against such groups. Trying to prove the intent to discriminate is very difficult. However, this decision was by a 5-4 majority, with Justice Kennedy in the majority, and his departure from the court suggests that this recent decision may be in peril the next time this question comes before the court, which may be soon, because the current administration is trying to undermine HUD's regulation, implementing the Inclusive Communities decision. On affordable housing, there have been some recent moves in Minneapolis and elsewhere to restrict single-family zoning in the interest of allowing higher density, which might increase housing opportunities for low or moderate income renters. But then NIMBY, not in my backyard, is still alive and well. We might also see more moves to vouchers. Public housing remains widely segregated and woefully underfunded in terms of necessary maintenance. And research suggests that allowing people to move to areas with better schools and job opportunities can improve outcomes for both parents and children, although transportation may still be a problem. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." We'll see how true that is with respect to housing discrimination over the next few years as America continues to become more racially diverse.
That was fantastic. My goodness, what a great discussion of the years that you were involved in fair housing. I am just thrilled with this. I think you've done a great job. And thank you so much for being there, for continuing to champion the rights of people, the right way to do it. I really appreciate.
Well, I spent some time trying to recall some details, and it was a good experience to to think back over all that time, and so many people who helped along the way. You don't accomplish things just on your own, and having Sam come there right at that point was a wonderful stroke of luck. Otherwise, I probably would have stayed in the general counsel's office forever. So that was extremely lucky. And something I didn't mention is that after I had applied to the personnel office for a job at HHFA and got a negative thing, my then mother-in-law wrote a letter to secretary. Yes, to the secretary, and on the basis of that, I got an interview with the general counsel, who was not later. That was McGrath was later. I'm trying to think who that was. And when I had the interview with Milton Seymour, and when I had an interview with Mr. Seymour, he said fine, and he assigned me to work with my first my first boss in the general counsel's office, Eddie Levette. So, all that fit together, and you need breaks like that. Sometimes you just don't know where they're coming from. But it was a wonderful career there, really. A great education. Uh,
Well, and a great recounting of it. So thank you so much for participating. You just did a terrific job, and thanks for your service for all these years.
well, glad to do it, man. I enjoyed it, and I'm glad there was this opportunity, really.